Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video we're handing over to clever Miss Clark as she shares the final 3 short stories as part of the Bloody Chamber collection by Angela Carter. These are often called the wolf stories, and as she goes through each of these she's examining the contextual links, the thematic links, the literary methods, and fundamentally the links between each of these short stories and why they're positioned at the final hurdle of this short story collection. Before she goes any further, I'd love for you to like this video and please do subscribe. So over to you, Miss Clever Clark.
The 3 stories we're going to be comparing today are The Werewolf, The Company of Wolves, and Wolf Alice, and we can group these together as the wolf stories. There's a rich analysis both in terms of how they interlink, as well as the fact that they're the final 3 stories of the collection, and act as something of a conclusion to Carter's anthology. There are some key bits of context we need to consider when examining the wolf stories in Carter's collection. Firstly, and most importantly, all 3 are allusions to or reworkings of Little Red Riding Hood as a fairy tale. This is a story that was first immortalised by Charles Perrault, the French writer. However, many versions have existed before this, and like many fairy tales, it exists as part of the oral storytelling tradition, which means it is something that was passed down by word of mouth and therefore susceptible to variations. Additionally, all 3 stories centre in Northern Europe and Scandinavian climates, areas synonymous with wilderness and brutality, areas that have long winters and little daylight at this time. And lastly, all 3 stories include wolves both as characters and as symbols. And they are symbols which are commonly synonymous with predatory behaviour and often, although not exclusively, masculinity. When considering these 3 stories, I think the quotation at the bottom from Boadicea is key to remember here. This comes from the British Library article on Angela Carter. They are not stories about wolves, but about the human spirit. And it's crucial that we remember whilst all 3 stories employ wolves as characters and symbols, the predatory nature that they're examining is much more to do with mankind and with society as a whole. So, the first story we're going to delve into in more detail is The Werewolf, and the first of the 3 we'll be examining today. This is by and large the most straightforward of the 3 stories in terms of plot, but as with all of Carter's writing, there's a whole host of allusions, messages and commentary that she's making here that we want to unpick. The plot is very straightforward in terms of The Werewolf and the closest to the original plot of Little Red Riding Hood. A young girl walks to her grandmother's cottage and encounters a wolf. She cuts off the wolf's right forepaw to defend herself, but when she arrives at her grandmother's cottage, she realises that her grandmother is the wolf. Where her right hand should be is instead a bloody stump. As a result, the villagers kill the grandmother, and the young girl profits, getting to keep her land and her cottage at the end. As I've already said, this is the closest traditionally to Little Red Riding Hood as a story, as well as the closest to the fairy tale form. The prose here is far more sparse and clear-cut than other stories, both within the Wolf collection and the anthology as a whole, and this is a feature which is very common in the original fairy tales, where characters tended to be black and white stock figures with very little animosity or kind of grey area in the middle there. This helped to give a clearer and more simple message to the reader and a clearer and more simple outline of what they were supposed to learn. It's interesting here and important to consider what that message might be as we delve into the key methods and imagery of the werewolf in more depth and detail. And in fact, the brevity of this story is really one of the key methods that Carter employs here to make that message known. Similar to other stories in the collection, it takes place in a very conventional, clearly gothic fairy tale-esque setting of the woods in deep winter. We're told it's inhospitable and that they have cold weather, cold hearts. There is some blatant foreshadowing that goes on here in terms of the attitudes and the ideas of the people that we meet. This story very keenly parallels The Snow Child, another incredibly brief story in the collection which acts more as a vignette or a snapshot than a fully realised narrative. And much like The Snow Child as a story, it includes some really quite graphic and quite brutal behaviour from some of the characters. There are very clear parallels and allusions to Little Red Riding Hood here in the narrative structure, but it's important to notice that there are lots of other social and folkloric imagery that Carter employs here. We see towards the beginning of the story references to Walpurgisnacht, which is the German holiday when witches were supposed to go and theoretically meet the devil, as well as lots of references to witches and witchcraft. Most importantly, the line I would zoom in on here is the phrase that begins, "when they discover a witch." This implies a sense of certainty here from the villagers and is clearly Carter drawing a commentary on the way that society treats outsiders, going on to say statements such as, "some old woman whose cheese ripens when her neighbours do not, another whose old black cat, Sinister, follows her about all the time." It implies that they will inevitably seek out anybody who is other or different from them and use that as a weapon against them. Obviously, that's ultimately what we see as the story continues, and the villagers and little girl end up murdering her grandmother, with her taking the property for herself. The wolf here is not the predatory masculine wolf that we meet later on and that we're used to thinking of in Little Red Riding Hood as a story. Instead, there is something almost fragile and incredibly human about it. We're told that when Little Red Riding Hood slashes off the right forepaw, the wolf let out a gulp, almost a sob, when it saw what had happened. These are clearly vulnerable and human characteristics that seem quite anachronistic or out of place within our typical versions of Little Red Riding Hood. And it links all the way back to that idea we've discussed and mentioned earlier on, that wolves here are used as symbolic of the dangers of society and of humanity as a whole. We can argue in the case of the werewolf as a short story, that danger comes in the form of human society and human fear, rather than sexual predatory behaviour, as we'll see later on. And this brings us on really nicely to the key messages Carter is trying to communicate here. This is the first time within the collection that the dangers of society have been explored as overtly as they are. So far within many of her short stories, we've seen allusions to these commonly held beliefs and how dangerous they are to people. But at this point in these conclusive three stories, Carter has a lot more freedom to examine the ways in which social prejudice and that kind of mob mindset and mentality can actually lead to people's demise. It's interesting that that is the position of evil within this short story, rather than the more kind of obvious or expected sexual and desire-based danger that we're used to seeing in interpretations of Little Red Riding Hood. And it's also interesting that she uses that form of danger in the story which most typically fits with the fairy tale form, a form which is all about warning people about dangers and conveying a moral message. Potentially from that we can argue that the clearest danger she wants us to take away from this is the danger society poses to us. The second story that we're going to examine today is titled The Company of Wolves, and again parallels Little Red Riding Hood as a story very closely. It begins, similarly to the werewolf, with a young girl walking to her grandmother's cottage. However, in this story she encounters a handsome man on her walk. This man wagers her a kiss if he reaches the cottage first, and as a result she dawdles and lengthens out the journey, deciding she'd rather lose the bet and have a kiss from the stranger. However, this man is no mere ordinary man, and much like the grandmother in the previous tale, is in fact a werewolf in disguise. He reaches the cottage ahead of her, where he promptly devours the grandmother, and when the girl arrives and realises what has happened, and that he means to do the same to her, subverts her fate by instead seducing him. As we've already mentioned, this is once again based on Little Red Riding Hood as a story, however subverts our expectations slightly. In the traditional tale, Little Red Riding Hood is saved by the hunter who defeats the wolf. However, in this story, the hunter and wolf are synonymous with each other. It's interesting that Carter chooses the role of hunter in this story because it has a dual meaning in the respect both of being a woodsman and of somebody hunting and pursuing something, somebody predatory, much like the wolf itself. As we examine the methods within the Company of Wolves, it's clear that there are some contrasts and parallels to the werewolf, the first of the three wolf stories we've examined today. In sharp contrast to the very sparse, bleak prose that we see in the werewolf, the Company of Wolves features much lusher and more prosodic language, almost paralleling the kind of language that we see in the first story within the collection, The Bloody Chamber. We get the impression this language is purposefully supposed to be seductive and mesmerising, much like the hunter or wolf who acts almost as a trickster figure within the story. He is overtly predatory both as a man and a wolf, and before he even arrives at the grandmother's cottage, we are told that there are gleaming trails of spittle which cling to his teeth, an image which is synonymous with carnivorous predatory animals. Another clear method that we see throughout the short story is the symbolism of the colour red. It's apparent across the course of the story and is highlighted in phrases such as the colour of poppies, the colour of sacrifice, the colour of Menzies. The correlation between sacrifice and womanhood here is a particularly interesting one and highlights one of the central turning points of many of Carter's stories, the balance between both growing up as a woman and vulnerability. Interestingly, you might have noticed by now that the colour red also appears throughout the course of Carter's collection. From The Lady of the House of Love to The Bloody Chamber, it's a colour that we see appear over and over again. And it's a colour which is synonymous and representative of both power and of destruction. That repetition and that reoccurring motif is something that's really clear, really key to examine and to unpick yourself when you come to write on this collection and when you come to draw those comparisons across the course of the anthology. However, arguably the key moment from the Company of Wolves to examine is the resolution or climax of the narrative. It's the part of the story that arguably links most clearly back to Bodisha's commentary that the danger is humanity and masculinity. And Carter constructs an ending which is quite ambiguous in tone, with us being able to see it both as something strengthening and empowering and as something worryingly coercive. Initially, the statement that the girl burst out laughing, she knew she was nobody's meat, gives her a level of strength and agency which is rarely seen across the anthology, let alone wider writings of the time. However, it's really important that we view that statement in the context of what is happening here. Whilst that line gives our female character agency in a sense of strength and seductive prowess that we don't see often in women, especially in writing up until the 1980s, we also need to explore the fact that it happens within the context of violence and quite coercive behaviour. This is a woman who is aware that her grandmother has just been killed and eaten by the man standing in front of her, and that the same fate awaits her. Can we really argue that it's agency and that it's sexual confidence if you're only sleeping with somebody to avoid being eaten alive? Does she lose some power within that context when we're told, "What big teeth you have," and she saw how his jaw began to slather? It's important that we ask ourselves these questions when we look at stories like The Company of Wolves, because Carter really wants us to challenge them and engage with them. In contrast to the rest of the anthology, it would be very easy for us to take this short story as one that is revolutionary and represents a bit of a turning point. A woman with confidence in her own sexuality and who's not afraid to harness that. But it's important to view that within the framework of patriarchal control and of predatory masculinity that we see within this story. And we can instead debate that actually, as a woman, it's not really agency if you're only doing it to avoid a lesser fate. Wolf Alice is the final story we're examining today, and it's both the last story in this trio and in the collection as a whole, acting as Carter's reflection on the entire anthology. It charts the life of a young woman called Alice who is quite literally raised by wolves and is then taken to live with a reclusive and strange duke. And it's important to note that it is the story with the loosest links to Little Red Riding Hood as a narrative. There are some elements of the story within this, but it also references lots of other elements of folklore and supernatural figures, such as the zombie, the ghostly bride, and the vampire. How far Wolf Alice departs from the traditional fairy tale form and allusions to fairy tales is something you might want to consider in your own analysis of the text and in your own comparisons of the stories, as well as what messages Carter might be trying to convey by having Wolf Alice, the story that deviates the most from accepted fairy tale forms, be the final one in the collection. There are many methods we can examine when exploring Wolf Alice as a story. However, the key overarching one that I think is most salient to engage with here is the sense of agency Alice has as a character. Throughout this short story, we see allusions to things which feature across the collection: mirrors, ball gowns, the idea of womanhood and growing up, the looming empty Gothic castle. And all of these features are used in a way which actually subverts and challenge typical views of society we've seen so far. In fact, it's Alice that subverts and challenges them. We can argue that Wolf Alice as a story is an allegory for what happens when women are left to their own devices, and the sense of certainty, control and stability they can find within that setting. Alice is given these trappings of femininity but uses them for her own purpose, with the ball gowns acting as sanitary products or bedding as she grows up. She learned that the mirror isn't in fact a playmate for her, but a trap and a cage, giving only a dim reflection of herself that loses any agency. These have sharp contrasts with stories like The Bloody Chamber and The Courtship of Mr. Lion, which exist at the beginning of the collection. Within those short stories, our female protagonists are enraptured with their own reflections, are seduced by the rubies of the choker and the beautiful clothes that their husbands can provide for them. Alice doesn't fall foul of that trap and instead recognises it for exactly what it is. In fact, that method is continued by the very danger that humanity provokes in her. They're the people that took her family away from her, that shot at her, that poked her with sticks in the case of the nuns and the orphanage. Humanity itself is something that poses a threat to Alice, and therefore isn't something she's interested in. Additionally, it's interesting to view how Carter uses the moon as a symbol within this short story. Throughout both the anthology and Gothic literature as a whole, the moon is symbolic with nighttime, with the supernatural and with danger. However, within Wolf Alice it becomes much more symbolic of femininity as a whole. It's what she uses to chart time, to chart her development and ageing, to track her period, to create her own system for living. Within Wolf Alice, we can see these features that typically belong to the supernatural and to folklore as being something which helps her shape a more independent, confident lifestyle for herself outside of those dangers of society that we've seen across the anthology so far. And that quite naturally leads us to consider the resolution and climactic moments of Wolf Alice. This story not only ends the 3 wolf stories, but also the collection as a whole, acting as a resolution to the entirety of the anthology. It's interesting to note that at this moment we see a stronger sense of freedom and identity in our protagonist than in any of the stories so far, and that leaves us with some key impressions of what Carter's messages and ideas are about women and their place in society. There are also some clear parallels between Wolf Alice and the ending of The Tiger's Bride. The Duke is a figure who is locked half and half between 2 strange states, saved only by the ministrations of Alice as she licks at his skin. However, unlike The Tiger's Bride as a story, the tone here is tender and nurturing, not sexualised. Alice is the confident one in control, with the lucidity of the moon to guide her, and we get a much more equal egalitarian sense in their relationship, rather than one that is driven by desire. This marks a key change in the tone of the relationship from other short stories within Carter's anthology, and leaves us with some important questions about what exactly Carter wants us to take away from that as a result. Both Alice and the Duke exist outside of the parameters of conventional society, having been shunned by that, and potentially Carter is alluding at that as the only way out for people that want that sense of confidence and control here. And so, of course, it's also crucial that we explore and examine the links, not only between these 3 stories, but the anthology as a whole. In fact, we can see these 3 stories as acting as a sort of drawn-out conclusion to the collection, summarising the ways in which society can be dangerous and highlighting some of Carter's key messages in prompting us to challenge the expectations it holds. The first 2 stories are explicitly predatory, albeit in different ways, demonstrating vulnerability even when we think we have agency. And all 3 are concerned with key messages about society and the danger it poses, whether you choose to conform to it or step outside of its boundaries. As a result of this, I would prompt you to go back through the collection and anthologies so far and look for other elements of those patterns within the short stories. Where can we see Carter signposting us towards this conclusion and highlighting these inherent dangers that she explores so explicitly through the symbol of the wolf and through these 3 stories?